which I have been doing at Cerrada, and it's like a work in progress, so it's pretty much incomplete. And can you hear me, or because I don't speak so?
It doesn't sound like microphone.
Microphone.
Oh, okay. So I should speak louder.
Well, let's see if also that microphone works.
Okay.
That's on.
Hello.
Or do I have to open any more of these? No, this is a DVD.
Hello. Yeah, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Okay, so this is a research I have been doing at Cerrada, and it involves how we make this arts and arts education environments better for people that have different disabilities, and my focus is mostly on neurodiversity, and I'm going to talk about that, and also I'm going to talk about some experiments we did and I plan to do with some artistic research involving that. And the main concept I'll be using in this lecture is the concept of hospitality of Derrida, that he's later discussed as hospitality. And I'm going to talk about how can we try to make a step towards a more absolute hospitality for people that are in the spectrum of neurodiversity, but also people that are disabled somehow. So I'm going to also talk about ableism. And later we will do a small exercise inspired in Lydia Clark's proposition. Lydia Clark was a Brazilian artist that worked a lot with people who are in the spectrum, and he worked a lot with simple materials, and we're going to do a little exercise with basically paper and scissors and glue. So my first idea was to put the exercise on the beginning, but I figured that maybe it's better when you do, like, if there are questions, we can start doing the exercise and do the questions at the same time, so we like feel more together, maybe, I don't know. So I'm gonna start with the concepts. So I think it was in the beginning of the 90s, Derrida wrote this. It was an interview he gave to Anne de Fourmentel, and he discussed the idea of hospitality and why it's a dangerous concept. It's not that he's against hospitality, it's that we need to give a step more even after hospitality. And then later, I guess it was in 2002, or yeah, I guess it was 2002, he wrote this article that was called Hospitality, that was published, at least it was translated in 2002. So, but how does he define hospitality? He defines hospitality as the means, the right of a stranger not to be treated with hostility when he arrives in someone else's territory. It's like a condition of coexistence that enacts a double-bind movement in two layers of the law. One of that states imposed to its citizens and the visitors, and the law of the household, its disposition or economia. So basically, he describes hospitalities in two different layers. So there's the law of the state, but there is like this certain behavioral patterns you're expected to have when you enter in certain environments. But the implicit roles of hospitality are, in Derridian terms, spectral, and what is implied or sub-implied in the device of hospitality. And why does hospitality is already hospitality? And they make themselves present in their apparent absence. If we do not know what hospitality is, it's because the thing with which we is not something is not an object of knowledge, nor in the mode of being present, unless it's the law, the should be our obligation, the law of hospitality, the imperative of which seems moreover contradictory or paradoxical. So what he's trying to say is that the layer of hospitality is like an invisible layer that it's not strictly coded in words, but it's some rules that are expected to follow when you enter in some some specific space. And I'm going to talk about specifically about arts education and arts environment. So because you enter those spaces and there are no strict rules, but there are, you just don't know. And not all bodies are, not all bodies that are not completely able according to the normative standards, they can perform according to the laws of the hospitality. So basically, he describes when hospitality becomes hospitality. It's like a double movement. So the person that enters the environment and also the person that receives, they become hosts of this device of hospitality. It's like a Foucauldian device. It's both discursive and spatial material. So the stranger, the awaited guest, is not only someone to whom you say come, but enter without waiting. Make a pause on your own home without waiting. Hurry up and come in, come inside, come within me. Not only toward me, but within me, occupy me, take place in me, which means by the same token, also take my place. Don't content yourself with coming to meet me or into my home, as if then the stranger could save the master and liberate the power of its host, as if the master, qua master, were a prisoner of his spaces and his power, of his ipsiety, of his subjectivity. His subjectivity is hostage. So it's indeed the master, the one who invites, the inviting host, who becomes the hostage, and who really always been. These substitutions make everyone into everyone else's hostage. Such are the laws of hospitality. So this short description is really complicated, but again, what he's trying to say that the space is predetermined, and both the one that receives and the one that's arriving, they're stuck in this model of this kind of safe, or not safe, but this kind of expected behaviors they have to comply when one enters. It's a lot of people discuss this when they talk about immigration. So when the stranger comes to your country, says, yes, of course, you're welcome, and etc., but then there are these implicit rules that you have to start speaking their country language, and etc., which is totally fine, but it's very kind of, it assumes this hostile facet on diversity, and especially where I'm going to try to talk is how hospitality is a device that excludes non-able bodies. So if hospitality is tricky, how can we undo it somehow? If hospitality, they are discursive and material apparatus that form what Foucault would call a diagram or a dispositive, and to undo it we need practical and operational techniques. So if hospitality is bounded by discursive, spatial, and societal configurations, we need to stretch it towards radical inclusion, always thinking these constraints as prototypal and passive being reassembled. And intensive hospitality involves the risk of dealing with the uncertainty that one's space may not retain the same physical, functional, and discursive characteristics after the newcomer arrives. It requires to embrace the queering of the space itself, its contingency. So one of the things is, while we're thinking about creating spaces that are open to people who have different perceptions of the reality, is that, or different perceptions, we have to think the spaces are as unfinished devices, and the space is a device that's open to be changed. It's open to the contingency of these subjectivities that enter the space. So, of course, that involves some risk of those who are receiving, because they are used to have like always this same kind of material configurations for the university or the art spaces, and of course there are safe boundaries, and we're going to discuss that. So the space does not host; it needs to be immanently built with the one that enters it. It's the contingency or the instability of a space in current Barad's technology, the queerness of matter. In the neurotypical world, for example, hospitality is always hospitality. For fidgeting or displaying a different modulation or absence of eye contact is never welcomed. and I put here a quote from this autistic activist Jim Sinclair. So the language we speak, we who cannot see without, we who can see without looking, we can talk without looking. So there are two things here. One thing is that we need to start to think the spaces in arts education environments as open, in the sense that they need to be rebuilt, and they're unstable, and they need to rebuild according to the appetites of those who arrive, and those have different tendencies, and those have different necessities, especially if we're talking about a lot of layers of different kinds of disabilities, visible or invisible disabilities. And talking about what I call invisible disabilities, that's, for example, all those who are categorized in the neurotypicality. For example, autists, people who have ADHD, or people who are Asperger. They have different kinds of and different levels of how they interpret and how they perform language. Talking or not talking, looking or not looking in the eyes, and that's why not all those spaces are designed to receive these people, but the spaces they need to be they cannot be ready for these people. They need to be co-built with them, as if it's like they are unfinished and contingent, and I like to call them prototypical. So later I'm going to talk about how what definition of the prototype I'm using, but it's basically thinking spaces and the curriculum, the other devices of the university, like the curriculum, are as unfinished and always in beta. So it's like how people describe in the software industry, things are all in beta because they're not looking for a finished product or a ready version of it. They need to be always being built. So how to queer hospitality? To queer his hospitality is to appropriate the potential it gathers to deter traditional rhetoric situations, embracing modes of presentation beyond the linguistic and rhetorical constraints, and to take seriously what Melanie Yergeau claims to be as rhetoric, or the rhetoric of those who cannot be read as neurologically typical. So for my part, I want a rhetoric that ticks, a rhetoric that stims, a rhetoric that faux pas, a rhetoric that adverts eye contact, a rhetoric that lobs theory of mind against the wall. So this is Melanie Yergeau is it's like the most famous. I'm not sure, but the one famous autistic and gender researcher from Michigan, and they discuss a lot how the concept of rhetorics is built on very established conceptions of communication that involve. So basically what they are saying is that the traditional model of rhetorics accepts only communication through talk and as the one that represents the status of the rhetorics. What they want to do is like to broaden the definition of rhetorics, so other forms of communication, bodily communication, or even communication with sounds that cannot be understood completely, they're also included as forms of rhetorics that have the same status as the traditional understanding of rhetorics in both in linguistic but also in cognitive psychology, for example. So many fields of the positivist stream of thought do not recognize marginalized bodies as righteous possessors of rhetorical tendencies. There are intimacies, I'm quoting them, and knowledges that exceed the eye-to-eye, the gaze, the querying of the few, reference, and looking. That's why Yergeau affirms that diplomacy is an holistic construct, one that's straight configured so as to disinvite neuroqueer subjects. These categories that they are talking about, they are also categories that are somehow contingent. So Let me try to explain. Well, basically, what they're trying to say is that these intimacies and knowledges that are not recognized in the environments, for example, the ones that perceive themselves beyond the unitarian subject, and that's something that it's kind of very common if you think about people that are in the spectrum of neurodiversity. The definitions of where one body ends and where one body begins is not. They are not perceived in the same way as people that are neurotypical, but that's not a generalization. I'm saying that it can be the case, and then how can we try to promote an idea of absolute hospitality towards these people that express themselves and they are present in the world in a different way than the normative way of being? And how can we try to do that in the arts environment spaces? First, and I should have done that before, but I'm gonna try to define what neurodiversity is and what I meant by it. So I mobilized the concept of neurodiversity as the activist and academic movement that demanded recognition of a multiplicity of modes of existence by the autism and other disabilities activists, especially after the 90s. It's a movement that gained influence with blogs, websites, and YouTube channels. And it's a movement that presupposes that neurological variations are one between many natural configurations of the human body and subjectivity, that gender, race, and class. And this is kind of not a concept of neurodiversity that's accepted by all the people who advocate for it. So there are a lot of variations. What kind of disabilities are included in the spectrum of neurodiversity? And there is also a lot of discussion about, for example, when you think about what is called high functioning and low functioning autistics, how they can be categorized in the same. They can be in the same spectrum. There are, and I believe in a more broader concept of neurodiversity, but I'm going to present as well some provocations done by people who think a concept of neurodiversity should be more strict. So, for example, Jausma and Welling, they advocate for a narrow concept of neurodiversity that would include high-functioning autistics, but not autistics diagnosed as low-functioning. And that they do that for a reason, because they claim, and they're in that claiming they're not wrong, that these people, they have different necessities, and when you have people who do not talk, you may need some special equipment and people who facilitate their life, but I don't think, and they argue that creating a broad concept of neurodiversity would erase the what is called low functioning autistics, and it would be something that fits only the high functioning autistics, because it's basically a concept that was created by them, and they don't have the same necessities. But if you think about, for example, the autistic psychologist Dr. Jacques Derrida, she points that that kind of argument developed by Jausma and Welling strengthens the dichotomization between low-functioning and high-functioning autistics, and they do not take into consideration the internal variations, the contingencies of every subject's condition. What she meant by that is that people may have even different necessities. The same person may have different kind of necessities depending on the where in the life the person is, and depending on the day and depending on the task. So, for example, Melanie Yergeau talks about the Zeno paradox. The Zeno paradox is from Parmenides. Is basically you are never neurodiverse enough for some tasks, but you are too neurodiverse for some tasks. Someone may say, "Wow, but you're not neurodiverse because you were able to write a thesis and we're able to do this and do that, but that doesn't exclude that you may find difficulties in other parts of your life or in other moments of your life, because it's not like if you're in the spectrum, it's not that you're in a straight line that's going to be like that for the whole life. It depends on the contingencies of every situation. So that's why Jacques Derrida points this kind of argument of creating a narrow concept of neurodiversity is a bit problematic. I myself try to solve this puzzle of by thinking the spectrum of neurodiversity through the biopsychosocial model of disability that considers, yes, disabilities are people are disabled because the societal institutions and discourses, they are not prepared to receive this radical diversity, but also people have different biological necessities and psychological necessities. So it's kind of it's something, and it's also a model that's used by the United Nations, if I'm not wrong. But so this is Melanie's book. So hospitality and neurodiversity. So not all bodies carry the same understanding of where one body ends and where other begins, like the neurotypical subjects do. And to be considered diplomatic, one must behave, move, and communicate in prosocial appropriative ways. So diplomacy is kind of one of these small pieces that construct the device of hospitality. And remembering that the idea of towards radical hospitality would be not only the acceptancy, but accepting the contingency of all these different subjectivities in the same place and trying to create a common ground from that. So hospitality chunks the contours of one's perception into neurotypical categorization of the apprehension of the qualities of the world. So repetitive patterns and echolalia is a kind of repetition that some people in the spectrum do. It may be in words or maybe some gestures. They are understood as acts not capable of producing novelty of difference, but as elements that cut or avoid communication. And communication in the traditional understanding of rhetorics and hospitality is understood solely as linguistic communication. So it excludes all other forms of relationality and even relationality towards non-human objects or non-human entities like other creatures, animals, vegetables. So what is diplomacy and how it fits in this device of hospitality and hospitality? So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word diplomacy refers to the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, or skill and tact in dealing with people. And Melanie argues that the diplomacy is merely another kind of invitation, an opening through only the few have means to enter. The diplomat, in other words, acts as a mediator between different worlds or modes of perceiving and communicating that require complying to different sets of rules based on a common denominator. So the diplomat basically is creating a bridge, but the idea of having this bridge that connects, it also implies that these people are completely separate and not in a spectrum of different subjectivities or different kinds of modes of perceiving, and also creates like a kind of ontological hierarchy between different modes of perception. So the mediator builds bridge between worlds constituted by different languages, cosmologies, ethnicities, and modalities of perception. The affordance of this role implies that the existence of an ontological gap between the sides under mediation, that there is a clear divide. So the linguistic and the non-linguistic patterns of behavior are not seen as parts of the same continuum of experience. And are universities and other arts education spaces inhospitable? And I have this really good article that describes like the five main 5 main topics that constitutes the ableism in general in the university and arts education spaces. And I try neurodiversity for sure. It's somehow included in the ableistic discourses, some kind of inability to perform in academia and other arts education spaces. So these components, the Carter and et al., they describe is ideology, bureaucracy, physicality, temporality, and sociality. By ideology, they describe the discourse that permeates graduate schools, implying that the best minds are those accepted into these environments. It's a typical behavior to negate neurodiverse subjectivities in academia, either through raising our disabilities to rightfully include us as able, or by using our disabilities as justification for excluding us as unable. The physicality does not refer only to making the buildings and the work materials accessible to those who have numerous conditions. The physicality oppresses through the structural hierarchy imposed by the graduate school. We're also signifying the kind of physicality needed to maintain the proper graduate student timetable. The physicality thus encompasses the fulfillment of activities beyond the space of the classroom, including going to numerous events, congresses, etc. in a short period of time. That may be tricky for people that are somehow disabled, both in visible or invisible conditions, especially for people. For example, I was talking to somebody who has brain damage, and for them it's completely difficult to be accepted and to be into the university, because the continuous time that's needed for this person to stay in the universities cannot be done. The person needs to rest from time to time. So how can we think also the physicality also in terms of the time spent in this university and create a space that receives these necessities, and a space that's built with the person who has these necessities. And sociality, that's another concern of them, relates to the physicality, which spaces are designed to embrace neurodivergence, but I would say all people who are in the disabilities, who have some kind of disabilities, and more than that, to build networks of researchers, since most of academia involves social connections and networks typically built to traveling to conferences, but can be as simple as going out with your cohort or attending dinner events with visitors and scholars. So it's kind of all these hidden necessities that not all people can conform to be able to continue in the university and to build a career in the university and in the arts educations as well, arts in general, because arts is all about creating these networks, and not all bodies are ready to do that, but it's also tricky to exclude them from this possibility. Temporality is like we physically cannot bear the tolls of this labor and are told repeatedly that this is a failure inherent in our body minds. This, of course, coincides with the temporality of graduate education, which is, in our current neoliberal moment, continuously speeding up. There are time-to-degree benchmarks we inevitably miss, and funding opportunities tied to these markers. Graduate students are expected to progress through programs at a timely rate and through each milestone in a particular way. This usually leaves disabled graduate students behind, because we simply cannot work this way. And finally, bureaucracy. Bureaucracy refers to the successive steps a neurodiverse or disabled individual must take to get specific needs and benefits, including situations that may generate anxiety and stress in providing their necessities. So Yergeau mainly talks addressing to the Parmenides zero paradox. While in some situations one is considered too neurodiverse to get specific jobs or grants, however their intelligence questioned, in others they are not read as enough neurodiverse to have their needs fulfilled by the public institutions. So it's kind of you're too much for some tasks, but you're considered not enough for other tasks. And also there is, of course, this stigmatization of, for example, people who are nowadays, the stigmatization of the person who has Asperger as like the male white guy that is somehow genius. That's this is specifically in the U.S. is kind of ubiquitous stigmatization of the body, and also, of course, it's excluding what it says. You never see, for example, autistic or Asperger's characters that are black in TV series, because, of course, there is the racial bias that defines, well, of course, if this category of people are genius, it's only the category of white people that are considered autistic and Asperger as genius. And also, if you look at, for example, you can look in the US report on the people diagnosed with autism, most of them are white, because people of color do not even reach the level where they can of the system where they can get a diagnosis, or they are considered just problematic. So there are a lot of intersectional levels of problems in this area. And a brief definition of ableism in general. So arts education environments are mostly ableistic. They reinforce the dichotomy between what it means to be sane and mad, able and disabled. We understand ableism as a system of causal relation, I'm quoting Campbell, about the order of life that produces processes and systems of entitlement and exclusion. This causality fosters conditions of microaggression, internalized ableism, and interjustling notions of unencumbrance. A system of dividing practices, ableism institutes the reification and classification of populations. Ableist systems involve the differentiation, ranking, negation, notification, and prioritization of sentient life. Now I'm going to talk about an experiment that we did where I was in Concordia University in Canada, and this laboratory called the Sense Lab. It's a laboratory for research creation. And of course, this is an example, and it shouldn't be taken as an universal understanding of how to build a space for people that are somehow in the spectrum of neurodiversity, or also people who are they have different disabilities. Of course, but the idea is that the space itself, as an example, is just the idea is that the concept of how the space needs to be built should be taken, but not the space itself is an iteration of that. It's not an objective, or so it's challenging to make the university and artistic spaces look and feel less dangerous to neurodiverse subjectivities. Regular classrooms and art studios mostly favor those who can bear frontal conversations and look into each other's eyes. Even in more decentralized modes of distributing the bodies in the classroom, like circles or small work groups. Evaluators do not understand relations with the field materials as relations worthy of being valued, consider, discussed, care about. It's a responsible mode of thinking of the lacking care with non-human materials and their agential capabilities. So one thing that I did not talk is that when you talk about people that are in the spectrum, you also talk about this stigmatization that those people are, they are irrelational, or they are unempathetic. But what we need to understand is that the idea of relationality and the idea of empathy should be not understood as how we take it. So empathy towards the other woman, or towards the towards the similar, but also empathy towards the absolute difference that is also present in non-human materials. And the same goes to relationality. So people, when you're diagnosed and you were a child, that we used to, people still do that. doctors used to do that or used to say that, but nowadays but people still say that you were non-relational because you have your own board, you play with your materials, but you don't play with other people. So the idea is, if you're going to create a space that's open to all kinds of relationality and people who have different sensibilities to human and non-human relationalities, you need to create a space that's not centered only in the human sociality. So I'm going to talk about the space that we try to build in Canada. So this is like, it was in the Sense Lab in Canada. So this was, so you see that there are different iterations and it changes a lot. So basically it was an office room until 2016. And I was there in 2016, and then there was this idea that was not strictly related to building a space open for people who different kinds of perception of the world, but the idea was to build a garden and suspended gardening or something like that. But then people would start to come, and it was kind of emergent proposition. People started to come and move things, and there were a lot of things in the shelves, and people would start to like collectively build space. And a lot of the people were in the neurodiverse spectrum, because the classes that were being held there, they were about neurodiversity. So a lot of folks were interested, but also a lot of people did not go to the space because it was a space in the university and a space that's very much restrictive, and the space so you have like this culture that you need to ask for a teacher to be part of the class, even if you have to only audit. So most people felt frightened of being there, even if the topic of the classes were neurodiversity. But then we start to think the space as a prototype, and the space as a laboratory. And every day people would enter this space and move things and chunk things or expand things as they wish or as they are needed. So some people needed to hide, some people will need to appear, some people will need to touch something, and this a lot of people think that this is like an installation proposition, so it's very Instagrammable. So people go there and take pictures, which is fine, but it was not exactly the objective. So for example, somebody we needed to hide or needed to not look to other faces in the class, they used to sit here, and this was built by these people. It's not the teachers or the researchers that did that. Everybody that was there could move, and they can do everything with the space. That's also a risk because they're dealing with things that other people did. But that's kind of the risk of assuming the contingency and the queerness of the matter itself, as Karen Barra said. You cannot have this certainty of how the space is going to last, or what are the needs of other people. It's kind of tricky because when you have people with different necessities, and people not only with invisible necessities like or invisible disabilities, that like mental neurodiversity spectrum or other, but people who have physical disabilities, they have to think about that as well, because this iteration, for example, may be tricky for somebody who has some difficulties in walking or seeing, but otherwise, the idea is that a lot of people say, well, but this is too overwhelming, and people who are nervous, they tend to be overwhelmed by things. The idea of the overwhelming is not a quantitative; it should be qualitative. What it means is not the amount of objects that may overwhelm somebody, but the kind of stimuli that does that. And also, of course, we had iterations of the space that were very clean, and so the idea is that it's always prototypical. It always changes with those who arrive. And that's basically the idea of absolute hospitality that Derrida looks for. It is to you accepting the risk that your space is not going to be the same when the other arrives with his subjectivity and his or her or their necessities, tendencies, etc. So I like to think this. I like to take the idea of the space as a topological, which is if you take mathematics and if you take, for Deleuze and Guattari analysis and discussion on the topological space, but if you want to take something from a person that's really a mathematician, I suggest you to read the Manuel de Landa take on topology and Euclidean spaces. But what I call this is not completely related or not completely equal to the mathematical definition, but what I call the topological space is a space that's contingent. It's open to non-human relationality. It is procedural. If you think about procedural world building, world games, procedural games are those that you are there and build the world yourself with the materials the game gives you, or the words that the world itself is building. That's a better definition. Not you build, but the world itself, it's building itself every time you load it. It's also based on commonality, difference and differency. So if you think about these people not as a stable identities like the identitarian paradigm, but you have to think the difference of those people as mutual inclusion, that I'm going to explain there. And the main aspect of the topological space is if you think the Euclidean space, this space is ready and is already drawn, the topological space is the space is defined by the relation of the points that constitute the space. So it's always relational. There is no inside or outside, but only the distance between the points that are constantly shifting. But of course, if you want the exact and the correct mathematical definition, I would suggest you to read this Manuel de Landa paper. And the Euclidean space would be like the helomorphic space, the space that's ready, and the human go there and modes it as if there is only unidirectional, one direction patterns of agency. So the space is ready for you and the humans go and mode it. And it's also, of course, the most, the phrase that defines this is the Genesis book's phrase that, and Lord God formed man of the dust in the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So it's kind of, you have the mud and the humans go and build one directionally what they want and not build a space with themselves. So it's I think it undermines non-human agency and it's thought on one directional agency. So topological space has no inside or outside and is defined by the relationality of its points. So if you think this philosopher Gilbert Simondon, he was a French philosopher of science from the 30s and 40s, and he used this talk about the intestines as topological spaces, because when you're inside the body or the human body, you lose the idea of where is outside and where is the inside. But remember, in the intestines are not truly and scientifically defined as topological, but the idea I want to do is like to trick the sense of inside and outside. So how to make it open to other forms of perception and being world, and also how we think these spaces if we're thinking about other kinds of disabilities as seen here in moving disabilities. And I think one idea is not only accepting the contingency and the transiency of the space, but also thinking multimodally and also thinking the space not only through the lenses of vision, because we're in vision-oriented world, but also thinking the space according to other kinds of stimulation, like not stimulation, but to the other senses. So how does a space that's open to be constructed with people who have different sensibilities should be built to accept, or not only to accept, but to be built together with these people with disabilities? I normally understand the idea of creating it's tricky because I don't know if there's an answer to that, or I know that Spinoza has a definition of the commonality and the commons, and Hart and Egnar, they work a lot with that. But it's still building a common ground where each necessity would perform separately, and they would have a minimum denominator, but I still think we need to think about an ecology where all those different kind of sensibilities, they are together and they are in the same world. Yeah, I don't know. Because when we talk about perception and people, especially people who are neurodiverse, they use this term chunking, so it's like the way you apprehend the world. And chunking is not necessarily exclusively quantitative. So that's the question: isn't the space too overwhelming, but also qualitative? What qualities and tendencies these spatial organizations undo in the university and other spaces normativity? To think about sensory overload, not exclusively to a quantitative prism. And this image, for example, is a exercise on drawing maps that Fernand Denilly. He was a French psychologist that worked with autistic and neurodiverse subjects, and basically he did a whole series of drawings where those people, they drawing how they perceive the world. So if you can, you check on Google Images, you put Fernand Denilly, and you see how the maps of the same place, they change a lot. And that's something I think we need to consider when we think about spaces that are open to this radical difference. And last, no, not last, but almost, how I understand prototyping in the space. So according to Cortsin Jimenez, who is an anthropologist from Spain, it's an understanding of the material assemblage configurations as beta, in the way the open software communities use the terminology. So the pieces, therefore, are always procedural, and the social relations that are constructed with the atmosphere of pedagogical spaces as well. So in this setting, the agency is not understood as being unidirectional, and in the case with the human modes and material according to their intentionality. Prototyping is what a perception of liberated and self-released social relationships may do to and through the material world. It's also a conception of material world in beta, does to social relationships. When referring to the prototypes of personality towards the reformulation of the University of the Art, the educational space in general, Yergeau, the fact that the layout of the arrangement may incorporate objects, the layout outside the laboratory walls, has led to thinking of experiments as scale-shifting devices capable of rendering the world proportionate to neo-onto-epistemic framework. So the idea of building spaces like that in the university, or spaces that are supernormative, is not that the space is only when you enter it, but somehow it needs to be leak, and it needs to shift shift people the way they think difference and diversity somehow. So it's kind of an activator that's in the space. That's one of the things that I have been talking about when you're trying to build a space like that, because a lot of people say, well, but you shouldn't do it in university because it's already you shouldn't do it, you should do outside. But I think and then another person said, yeah, you should do it inside the university, because then people are going to feel not threatened, but they're going to feel some kind of discomfort, and they're going to feel that something is leaking from there and something is changing, and what is changing, what needs to be changed is the perception of how other people and how to build an ecology together. So in the space, people can reconfigure in this position. I'm talking about the space I showed of the objects by building new thresholds like tunnels, hiding places, pathways, sessions of composing with materials immersed according to the appetites of the people who were there. It always starts in the middle, in the sense that there is not a formal call to action that orients what to do with the materials. And of course, approaches oriented and diverse work, if they promote mutual inclusion, are post-identitarian. I mean, post-identitarian is not it's against identitarian. It means that it's needs to think beyond, with the differences, but building like something ecologically together. So it's beyond that, and ideally against judgmental practices. When you have some such space that's contingency, you have a lot of people with different needs. Of course, you have misunderstandings and conflicts, and I think ideally the idea is not to take that through judgment, but also to think together how to think these necessities and the tendencies collectively, or at least collectively taking in consideration the different forms of expression these people have that may be linguistic or non-linguistic. So we need pedagogies that move towards a collectively transformative justice that denies linear causality centered into the subject of action towards the immanent building of the cooperative environments, considering its contingency and the plasticity that may generate uncomfortable situations. So what constraints can we experiment with to create pedagogical environments to follow the ethics of hospitality? I mean, absolute hospitality, not the hospitality that Derrida criticizes. They must be at least procedural. One must construct the space with the ones that are visiting. And assuming that each mode of existence and seeing the environment has the same ontological status as dealing with the possible conflicts, understanding that the majoritarian ways of composing social structures are already ever present in mostly all Western public and private spaces. So it's places like that are obviously not only for neurodiverse folks, but to undo and generate discomfort and self-criticism in the modes of existences that permeate university and art spaces. They are activators for new experiments and propositions. And I like to think difference in that setting, according to Massumi, that's a difference that's not based on a fixed identity, but is a difference that it's based thinking all the realm of difference and morphological and bodily and disabilities as a continuum. So in the logic of mutual inclusion, difference of degree and difference of kind are actively inseparable, two sides of the same processual coin. The continuum on which instinct and intuition differ by degrees is that of animal bodying. There are mix in which they come together again across their difference in kind of recursive functioning in animal bodying ever gestured event. The logic of mutual inclusion is ultimately a modal logic of continued variation. So it's thinking outside of essentialism and thinking all beings in the same continuum and thinking how human or non-human and other creatures live or dead in the same continuum of existence in the same ontological level. And lastly, I have been working a lot with post-qualitative inquiry, and I think the experiment we described could be categorized as a post-qualitative inquiry because it uses an ontology of immanence and transcendental empiricism, begins with the concrete encounter with the real that disrupts the dogs of common sense and good sense. It's creative and experimental, and each instance of a post-qualitative inquiry is different from the next. That is, it's created anew each time. And I think that's basically it. If you want, we can do the exercise, or we can also talk differently. I don't know what you prefer. Yeah.
Just spontaneously. I was really interested in what you were saying about creating these topological spaces.
Yeah.
That's involving accepting risk
Yeah.
of change, that the space will not necessarily be the same
Yeah.
anymore, that the people who use the space or inhabit it, create it together.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if it was because of risk, the word itself, but then my mind jumped to like discourses of safe spaces.
Yeah.
And like, so I wonder about the kind of, I mean, I understand that this is a risk, not a like, I mean,
Yeah.
there's some kind of risk, but like, and I was just interested in this kind of like, maybe tension between, right, like discourses of safe spaces,
Yeah.
maybe imply like some kind of conception of the common where everyone's minimum needs is still met, maybe going in that direction, or maybe not. Like, this is maybe not a question. Really.
No, yeah. No, I think it's possible to build a common discourse what people they need, and to build like not a list, but like something like how to make this space a safe space. And I think the idea of safe space does not is not necessarily excluded from topological spaces, because I'm talking about other kinds of risks. But of course, the risks that are in the spaces that are said safe spaces, there also can be they can happen also in this space. But I think the idea is like not to take them judgmentally, but think together how to approach them. And also, if we're doing like a list of how to make this space safe, I think the list must not be definitive, because it needs to be always being co-constructed. I think that would be interesting. I don't know how that could be done practically, but I think of course it can be done. Yeah, so I think it's not the idea of building a space that's topological space, what I call, but it does not exclude being a safe space. I mean, most of the objectives of this kind of space is also to be safe. Especially, it's to be safe for subjectivities that are not safe in spaces in general.
Right.
Yeah.
So the risk is like on the part of the host, maybe?
Well, I mean the risk because every person or every individual that goes there may have different necessities, and they must undo. Sometimes they undo things other people do,
Right.
and that's the risk, and you can have conflicts for sure. We had many in that space, and that's something we'll have to do together, but not in a judgmental way.
Right.
But it's tricky. Yeah. Yeah.
I try to formulate this. I'm not sure if I can do it, but I'm kind of interested because in many times art, like you speak about from perspective of art education or art mediation or something like that. So somehow there's this idea that something is being mediated, which is not in the space or in the situation in a way. So something is coming, something's already done already, somehow. That it's the tool or apparatus is telling about something towards someone.
Yeah.
And then this idea of immanent space, or a space which is kind of emerging through different bodies being in the space. And I somehow feel like that there might be some kind of I don't know what's the word, like some kind of friction in the idea of mediating something, and which is kind of transcendental idea of something being ready there and it's kind of moved somewhere, and then this idea of immanence of the space.
Yeah.
And somehow I'm kind of interested about this, like your idea of art education in general. What would be the idea of somehow is there an immanent art education in that sense?
I think there could be many ways of doing that, but so this is a space we propose, like, to activate something that is not necessarily resonate with another space, but also to resonate with how people think arts education. And I think if we think through a immanent conception, we would think that the things or the entities in the ecology, they are not mediated, but they are immediate to themselves. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Somehow this, I think that somehow, I don't know, there's this kind of friction or this dynamic between these understandings.
Yeah.
Which can be interesting. You know, I'm also looking at it from the kind of curatorial perspective.
Yes.
That says that if something is bring into the space of education or mediation, it's something which is already like someone is speaking about their research.
Yeah.
Someone is doing a performance, and then it's kind of put in the space or situation.
Yeah.
Like, and then if the situation is immanent in that sense, like Paradian sense of what you are kind of proposing, it also kind of affects on or it changes the thing, it's what is being mediated.
Yeah, of course. And there, talking from the experiences I had, there were a lot of conflicts regarding that, because a lot of people simply could not understand how it works, and they are always asking for a mediation. Even they were asking for mediation even in like subtle ways, but and I think, for example, the idea of the space is to have a space like that in university, so people would see and would feel some sparks to do something differently that would resonate not necessarily in the space itself, but it should leak somewhat. And so I don't know if I have an idea of immanent arts education, but it would be nice, yeah. But I don't know if I answered.
Yes,
Yeah.
somehow it wasn't more like a comment.
Yeah.
Somehow this kind of open.
Yeah. I think the idea is also to generate some friction between the models of being in these spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to articulate it because it's jumping in my head, all this. But I was wondering about, let's say, how you deal with the question of being together in terms of, let's say, on more ethical way. Or do you make any priorities? Like, because we can be together and communicate better, access.
Yeah.
Better. So what, I mean, being together in the same space is very complicated.
Yeah.
Taking just a really concrete example, if I'm taking the bus, I'm really concerned and I have always issue with people who speak loud in their telephone, and I'm like in the bus, I'm always questioning myself, like, okay, respect for me is this, but for this person it's that, you know? This is an example. But maybe being all together in the bus, we have to make a priority. Is it about accessing, communication, movement? So I'm wondering how do you deal with
the priorities?
Yes.
I'm not sure.
How to deal with this?
I think ideally, what the entity that would deal with that would be the people that are there and also the space itself.
Okay.
But for example, when you talk about the bus, I'm really I feel a lot of sensory overload. So when people are talking loud in the it's really bad for me. But when you think about this space, you have to think about not only in the people that are there, but you have to think about the materials as members or parts of the space as well. So I think it's always complicated to reach a common ground, and it's to establish priorities. Maybe sometimes is already already biased understanding, because if you're prioritizing something specific, if you're prioritizing communication, what do you mean by prioritizing communication? You're talking about verbal communication. It's already
and it implies a lot of value, belief, and all this.
Yeah, so it's already tricky if you're thinking about that, or if you're talking about movement. What do you mean by movement? Is about some people move differently, and people are always moving when they're still. So I think ideally is to think that together, and the conflicts will emerge for sure. But I guess if you prioritize, the conflicts will be worse because people will be already excluded before. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm thinking about it now.
I just try to be somehow more concrete.
Yeah.
Because you speak in a very clear way on, let's say, on the let's say intellectual and conceptual level. But I'm trying to say, okay, on the ground, being all together, it's already problematic. So
Yeah.
being inclusive, I got it, and I mean, of course, we have to work on that.
Yeah.
I'm sure word even is not a good word, but I'm wondering about how to deal in a very concrete way with priorities. I'm wondering we cannot do everything at the same time. So
No. But I think
how to do that?
I think that can be done only by doing it. I don't know if you can pre-think the conditions for that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe continue with your thought. And I was thinking about like traditions and conventions, and for example, in this institution, how much we depend on them. And we have admissions coming, and we are going to have people being assessed, and in a very normative way.
Yeah.
And so much of kind of the structures of what we do here is really normative.
Yeah.
Really quite ableist.
And
it's inbuilt in the traditions of the art form. So, I mean, I understand this idea of radical difference.
yeah,
I think the changes should be quite radical
yeah,
for any of that to be possible
yeah,
here. So, I'm just wondering how, because sometimes I get the feeling that because the change that would need to happen is so radical, it's easier not to think about that
yeah,
and to think that it's impossible.
Yeah.
So, like the small things
yeah.
we can do.
Like for example,
What are they? I don't know. Do you have some?
like for example, you were talking the other day that people that are disabled, it's tricky for them to enter into the dance education or the dance course.
Yeah, especially with.
I think that's one level of what needs to be approached, and that doesn't exclude this. You can have different levels of pragmatic approaches, and you can have traditional ways of inclusion, but you also can have experimenting. I think all of them can go together. And I think pragmatically, what can we do with those questions? Because I was talking also someday with somebody that really wanted to do a dance course here, but the person could not do because of the admission system. So how do we resolve that? If I think the people who work at the university also need to change somehow their minds about what means to be, or what means to be dancing, and what it means to doing some specific kind of arts. Otherwise, it's.
Also, are there, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. No, it's not. Are there any example of society where it works in some, you know, like as reference for this thinking? I'm like, okay.
Well.
Many things doesn't work, but are there any example of society where it works, where it's more inclusive? How they make, so maybe from an anthropologic perspective.
Yes.
So I'm wondering about.
Yes, I'm not remembering right now, but I know there are some cosmologies, especially Amerindian cosmologies, that work in a way like that,
Okay.
and they have been working. I can look after exactly, but they have been working for that like for centuries. So but also they have another way of understanding what disability is. That's not the Western. So you have cosmologists that think more in immanent way. You have others that are more transcendent. But that's not really. That's not exactly a problem. But of course, the idea here is to experiment with this immanence. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Too confused.
No, but when you say experiment, what do you mean?
No, experiment with spaces like that to see if some things leak to the institution.
Okay.
The idea of leaking, and also on the same time working with things like I was talking to Lisa, working in making the university more accessible in other levels as well. Mm-hmm. It's not exclusively. Approach. You have to work in many layers that are hidden. Some of them are not so hidden, like people who cannot be admitted. Yeah, that's completely not hidden, and it's ongoing in almost all institutions in the world. If you think about arts, especially talking about also the duration of the classes, and you don't have to. Maybe you don't have to redo all the classes, but you have to understand that some people cannot be on this long duration. You have a lot of. It's also a problem of sensibility, right? If you. yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm a bit confused.
So you want to apply this on here at UniArts, like to try?
Well, it's a project I submitted to the Kone Foundation, yeah,
Okay, okay. Super.
and also to the Academy of Finland with the people from Aalto and here. So the idea is like to build.
To try to
Yeah,
already.
it's a part of the project. Yeah,
Especially we are in construction right now. So.
yeah,
It's a good moment.
I'm afraid the project is already done.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They're not. They, well, it can be also something movable.
Yeah.
There is space.
Yeah, of course.
So speaking of, like, I was curious about the Sense Lab. How was it integrated in Concordia University? Like, how was, like, just thinking, like, where was it? How did you?
It was in the Concordia building in the center of Montreal, and basically the university at the same time it hated it, but at the same time it always puts its pictures on the front page of Concordia website. So it's kind of a double relation because it brings a lot of publicity to the university, but also they hate what is done there. So it's kind of
Can
Fair
you,
enough. Yeah. Sorry.
can you define the hate? That's way. I'm sorry, but I'm
no. A lot of people go there and say people that work there would say, well, that they really don't get the mass and things like that, really in a very unpolite ways. But also at the same time, the university liked it because it had a huge grant, and also it was good publicity for the university. So it's not the university itself; it's like different sectors. Yeah, not yeah.
No, not so. I was just a small comment because I was thinking like the universities are becoming more and more like corporations. So like this is a good example, I think, of exactly that. What happens is that you have like a creating like a project that you can create and say, oh great, you know, like you build your image at the same time like the culture, right? And students say the culture maybe it's not like such that it will be receptive to a leak at a larger
Yeah.
scale, but you know, and so I was just thinking about that. Well, what it means that universities are becoming more and more like corporation, like many of the kind of five categorizations of
Yeah.
what makes it difficult to live in this, to get in the spectrum of neurodiversity in universities, ideology, timetables. I mean,
And that's for disabilities in general, not only the neurodiversity. That
Oh, sure.
yeah.
Yes. Right now, I was just thinking, wow, yeah, it's true. Like everything is really fast paced.
Yeah.
Producing, like what you're producing, basically, like you know, at the rate of like global capital, basically.
Yeah. And with I think with the European agreement, the duration of the courses need to be the same for everybody in the EU, if I'm not wrong, or at least it's going towards that. I know some places, for example, in France, people could do the PhD in even 9 years or something like that. That's not possible anymore. But I don't know. I feel, of course, it's still very problematic, but in Canada it was way more enclosed, the system itself. I think here you have at least you have some funding agencies that fund things that are strange like this. Like for example, I'm not sure if it's, but Kone funds some things that really against this even they being a big corporation, but and the universities are a bit more open, but they're always getting more enclosed, so it's tricky. And also the hidden things, like as we talked, the networking and the things you need to do, not only in the university but also in arts spaces in general. It's also tricky to think always through the prism of sometimes people risk if they think about the prism of connectivity and the movement and the thing, but also that implies some kind of movement some people can do and others cannot do. So it's tricky. I don't know if there is an answer, but at least we can try some things here. Yeah.
thinking now like that there is a bit of a dilemma in, because I like this idea of this prototype space,
Yeah.
making the changes together with the people who come. But then if we think of like the admissions here, for example,
Yeah,
you should be somehow prepared for the different people to come.
of course.
Then you don't, at the moment, for example, we don't have that kind of much diversity in the applicants.
No, no, no.
So people don't apply because they know something about, okay, it's that kind of place for those kind of people.
Yeah, exactly.
So it would be really nice if we would have like people coming and applying who would shake things up and they
Of
would
course.
make the changes, you know, according to their needs, and that would make us question what we do. But that doesn't happen
No.
because of the way the traditions are, and they are also, they give a certain image to outside, and do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
There's this kind of dilemma of like, what can be done? How can we make space for some kind of difference that we don't know yet what it is, or what kind of difference it makes? So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how it works here, but I understand, as I try to understand, there are like different layers, and one layer is for sure institutional, and the institution needs to think, even not in the radical, the institution needs to at least embrace and invite people that are different.
Yeah.
That's one like basic level. It's very obvious, but it's also the level that's maybe the trickiest to happen.
It's not obvious.
Yeah.
I don't think it's obvious.
No, yeah. I mean, it should be obvious, yeah. But because I don't know exactly how it works here. I mean, I arrived recently, but I know all the places where I studied and where I worked, they were like very restrictive. It happens that people, what you said, people just don't go, don't apply, or people just, one thing that, for example, in this space, that people just don't go there because it's inside the university, and because the university itself is already stigmatized as a non-invite in it by reason, because it is it doesn't invite different subjectivities. So I think we need like at least different levels, or we need like new communication strategies maybe, and of course a new evaluation system, that's new evaluation for admission systems, and also more like even more pragmatic, maybe like, I don't know, like it's also tricky, but to think maybe, I don't know if it's like the case of reserving some spots for people, but then you also pre-understand what this being disabled is. I don't know. I think to begin with all, it's new communication strategy for reaching, and so the people know that's open. But for that, we need it to be open. So.
Exactly. So it's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment. I've twice applied here.
Yeah.
In the academy. That was ages ago. In 2002, I applied for the dance department, and in 2004 for the acting department. And both times I got to the second round. So back then, I think the admission process was different. So basically, anyone who took the written task seriously was invited to the second round, in which then the audition took place, and then I fell through directly at the second round. But to be honest, I must also say that for me back then it was more about applying as such than as like also because I thought it, like that it would be quite unrealistic like to get accepted eventually. And also I remember when I was auditing, I also in my own opinion I wasn't good. I really wasn't good. So I didn't deserve to proceed any further. But also back then I did this, I mean partly I wanted to provocate, and I also wanted to kind of like I don't know because I was and I'm still kind of interested in maybe more acting these days than in like art dance, but I also thought that I might help another person with a different body later on for that person to become that this institution it might become more prepared for different kind of bodies. So I, in a way, thought, okay, I would like to pave the way for someone who is more determined than I am, and maybe more talented than I am. But yeah, I don't know. I've heard of also another person, a female person in a wheelchair who I think has applied here, but didn't got accepted here, but has studied abroad and has
Yeah.
like, become a professional dancer. So abroad, it seems that in some countries, perhaps the attitudes are more progressive than in Finland.
Yeah. I mean,
Great, yeah, exactly. Kind of what I thought was like it would be important that people would apply, so that then we would be faced with a situation of how we are going to now organize the whole process, so that.
But I don't know. I mean,
it's
as
fair.
I said, that's like more than 15 years ago, or yeah. So I don't know whether it really made an impact on anything because I mean I was not on the other side. I was not part. I didn't read any. I don't know. Internal communication of the jury, obviously for obvious reasons. But I mean, so it's just mere speculation whether it. But I mean, the thing was when I applied for the dance department, I just happened to meet in the hallway the person responsible. I think the head of the department, dance department back then, and I recognized her and I acted whether it makes any sense in the first place for me to apply. And she said that yes, of course. I mean, show what you got. But also she said that the standard standard of quality is very high, and they cannot lower their standards for anyone.
oh,
I mean that was more than 15 years ago. I mean probably some changes have occurred in the meantime. And that was we have to remember in 2002. So yeah, time yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But in a way, I don't know. I mean, how say that they cannot lower the standard. I mean, for me, whatever that means, it also back then I kind of accepted it and it felt understandable. As an understandable way of kind of arguing that what they expect from an applicant.
yeah. I guess the application itself is like the idea of how the bureaucracy already makes bodies that are not traditionally able to even to try to apply. And I'm not sure how is the situation right now here towards there. Is there any changes?
Now there's a lot more interest, I think.
Yeah.
People want to think about this, and people want to change things to be more accessible. Also because of the Anti-Discrimination Act and the
Yes.
Convention of the Rights of Disabled People, and so there are things now that we have to think about these things now, whereas 15 years ago maybe it was still okay to just avoid these questions.
Because it's also like conceptual problem, how you understand what quality is and what evaluation means. So
And the standards, what are they?
yeah. Yeah. So for sure, changing the evaluation and methods is also even the evaluation in class also. Evaluation is always understood as, well, at least I'm not sure in the arts, but in other fields it's only written evaluation. In fields like philosophy or media studies, in arts you can have a product, but it's also a kind of standard that needs to be.
Because with the curriculum,
Yeah.
like for example, what people have learned outcomes, like how those things are worded,
Yeah.
makes a big difference, I think. Is there space for difference or not?
And for a PhD student, you have to have articles published. Yeah.
And then you want to be like a highly ranked university that produces, like quality in terms like who studies
Yeah.
there. I mean, so like it's kind of you backtrack and you have this.
Yeah.
And maybe you can see that for a while, but then I guess it's better to go back to your immediate surroundings. Otherwise, it's kind of paralyzing.
Because also the funding is attached to the amount of
Right? Money
amount of publications, and it's just tricky in so many levels that I don't know. Anything more?
It makes me think also that even me not facing so many difficulties, I realize I have all the time problems when it's the end. It's like the application or the thing, just in terms of going in the application system, it's already the first border.
Yeah.
Where you got so even you think in a good way, if the tools is already a problem.
Yeah, they're scary.
Somehow
Yeah.
we should almost destroy the first. This is the place where it has to be. With the best idea you could have, if the tool to get in the machine
Yeah.
is already problematic, and I'm facing it.
They're
Because it's human. I mean, all of it.
they are scary for sure for everybody that is. Anything more, or should we end? Okay.
No other questions or activities?
Thank
We
you,
can also
Francisco.
finish
It was
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.